Before we dive into this story, if you're here for real, lesser-known tales from World War II, stories about ordinary people who changed history in quiet ways, hit that subscribe button. You won't find these accounts in most history books, but they mattered just as much as the battles everyone remembers. Now, let's go back to the Pacific in 1944, to a flight deck where chaos was routine and two hand signals almost identical were killing men. The sun had just cleared the horizon when the first Hellcat rolled toward the catapult, its engine hammering the morning air with a sound that never quite left your skull even when you slept. The flight deck of an Essex-class carrier stretched forward like a steel prairie, shimmering with heat already though it was barely past 6. Deck crew moved in practiced choreography, their colored jerseys bright against the gray paint, yellow for plane directors, red for ordnance, purple for fuel, blue for chalk and chain men, green for catapult and arresting gear crews. Each man knew his place, his job, the gestures that kept 30 tons of metal and high-octane fuel from turning the deck into an inferno. The smell hit you first when you came topside, always. Avgas, that distinct bite of aviation gasoline mixed with hydraulic fluid, exhaust fumes, salt spray, and something metallic you could taste on your tongue, the very air of the carrier itself. The wind came from ahead, 25 knots of ship's speed plus whatever nature provided, enough to tear the cap off your head if you forgot to secure it, enough to make every movement deliberate, careful, because one slip near a propeller arc or a jet blast deflector and you simply ceased to exist. The deck pitched gently, a slow roll port and starboard as the ship carved through Pacific swells, and you learned to walk with it, anticipate it, make it part of your muscle memory or you'd never last a week. A young plane director stood near the island's superstructure, Kapok life vest snug over his dungaree shirt, goggles pushed up on his forehead, a pair of yellow paddles in his hands. He'd been on the carrier for 7 months now, long enough to stop flinching at the howl of a radial engine at full throttle 6 feet from his face, long enough to guide a damaged Hellcat with a fouled tail hook onto the deck without his hands shaking, long enough to recognize when something was wrong in the pattern of operations. And something was very wrong. He watched a blue shirt signal to the pilot of an SB-2C Helldiver taxiing toward the forward elevator, arms raised in what should have been a clear instruction: hold brakes, wait for the aircraft ahead to clear. But the gesture looked nearly identical to another signal: throttle up, prepare for launch, and for just a second the pilot gunned the engine, lurched forward before the plane captain screamed and waved frantically, and the Helldiver stopped 3 feet from the TBM Avenger folding its wings at the deck edge. The crash crew was already moving, foam canisters ready, but the moment passed. Another near miss. Another incident report that would be filed and forgotten. The plane director had been keeping a private tally in a small notebook he carried in his breast pocket, the kind of thing you weren't supposed to do but everyone did anyway because memory was fallible and numbers didn't lie. In the past 2 weeks, he'd counted 11 incidents, ranging from minor bumps that scraped paint to one genuinely terrifying moment when a Hellcat with a hung bomb nearly rolled into a fuel bowser because the director's signal was misread in the glare of late afternoon sun. 11 incidents that could have been 11 catastrophes. 11 times someone got lucky. The problem, he'd realized after days of observation, wasn't incompetence or fatigue, though both were constant companions on a wartime carrier. The problem was the signals themselves, specifically 2 of them. The first was the standard hold position signal, arms extended at shoulder height, palms out, which looked almost identical to the clear to taxi signal when seen through propeller wash, smoke from a previous launch, or the heat shimmer that rose from the deck like a living thing by midday. The second issue was the fold wing signal versus the spread wing signal, differentiated only by the direction of a circular motion that became invisible when the director's back was to the sun or when sea spray coated your goggles. He'd mentioned it once to his division chief, a grizzled bosun's mate who'd been on carriers since Coral Sea. The chief had listened, nodded, and said what chiefs always said: "That's how we've always done it, son. Navy's been using these signals since before you were born. You think you're smarter than Bureau of Aeronautics." The conversation had ended there, as such conversations always did, with the unspoken understanding that you didn't change things that worked, even if they only mostly worked, even if the failure rate was measured in bent propellers and wounded men. But the plane director couldn't let it go. He'd grown up in a small town in Ohio where his father ran a machine shop, and he'd learned early that when a tool didn't work right, you modified it or you made a new one. You didn't keep using a wrench that slipped just because that's the wrench you had. At night, in his rack in the berthing compartment 3 decks below, he'd sketch alternatives by flashlight, trying to find gestures that couldn't be confused even under the worst conditions. The motion had to be distinct, recognizable from multiple angles, visible through smoke and glare, simple enough to execute with frozen hands or exhausted muscles. The breakthrough came during a midnight watch when he was helping tie down aircraft after the last recovery of the day. The deck was quieter then, just the rush of wind and the thrum of the ship's machinery, and he found himself naturally using exaggerated movements in the dark, making his body language unmistakable to the men he was working with. That's when it clicked. The signals didn't need to be different in hand position alone, they needed to be different in body language, in silhouette, in the rhythm of motion. He refined his ideas over the next 3 days, testing them privately with a couple of friends from his division, men who understood the frustration of watching preventable accidents almost happen. The new hold position signal involved crossing the paddles overhead in an X, a shape that was impossible to confuse with anything else and visible from any angle. The throttle up signal became a forward thrust motion, both arms together, like pushing against a heavy door. For the wing signals, he added a 2-step motion, first indicating the wing itself by pointing, then showing the action with a clear fold or spread gesture, eliminating the ambiguity of a single circular motion that could mean either thing depending on context. The real genius, though he wouldn't have called it that, was adding contrast. He suggested that directors wear different colored gloves for different phases of operation, white for taxi and positioning, orange for launch prep, making it instantly clear what phase you were in even if the specific signal was momentarily obscured. He also proposed painting one side of each paddle white and one side international orange, so the director could flip them to create additional visual distinction. Getting anyone to listen was harder than designing the new signals. The Navy was an institution built on tradition and standardization, and for good reason. When you had dozens of carriers operating across the Pacific, you needed everyone doing things the same way so pilots and crew could transfer between ships without retraining. Change one carrier's signals and you risked creating deadly confusion when pilots who'd learned the new system found themselves on a ship using the old one, or vice versa. The plane director understood this, but he also understood that the current system was failing at a rate that would eventually kill someone, if it hadn't already. He went over his chief's head, which was a dangerous move that could earn you extra duty or worse, and requested a meeting with the air boss, the commander responsible for all flight operations. The air boss was a former dive bomber pilot who'd flown at Midway and had the kind of combat experience that made junior enlisted men nervous even when he was being pleasant. The meeting happened in the air boss's tiny office in the island superstructure, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, and the plane director stood at attention with his notebook and his sketches while the commander listened with an expression that gave nothing away. When he finished his presentation, there was a long silence. The air boss flipped through the pages of notes, the incident reports, the proposed new signals drawn in careful detail. Outside the small porthole, a recovery was underway, the distinctive howl of a hellcat hitting the deck followed by the screech of arresting wire paying out. The plane director waited, certain he'd just ended his career in aviation and would find himself chipping paint in some forgotten corner of the ship for the rest of the war. You counted 11 incidents in 2 weeks, the air boss said finally, not looking up from the notebook. That's 1 every 36 hours on average. Most of them unreported beyond your personal log. You know that's a violation of standing orders, keeping unofficial records. Yes, sir. I do. And you think your new signals will fix this? I think they'll make it harder to confuse one instruction for another, sir. Can't guarantee it'll fix everything, but it should help. The air boss closed the notebook and handed it back. You've got 24 hours. Tomorrow morning, first launch, you'll direct using your new system. I'll be watching from Vulture's Row with my stopwatch. If it works, we'll expand the test. If it causes confusion or slows operations, you'll be swabbing heads until we hit Pearl for refit. Clear. Crystal clear, sir. The next morning came too fast. The plane director barely slept, going over the motions in his mind, second-guessing himself, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. His division chief, when he learned about the test, had been furious and then resigned, telling him to at least try not to get anyone killed. The other plane directors had been briefed on the new signals, though most were skeptical and a few were openly hostile, seeing it as the dangerous whim of a kid who thought he knew better than the fleet. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute except for the red night vision lights on the deck and the blue glow of instrument panels visible through cockpit canopies as pilots ran their pre-flight checks. The first launch was always the most dangerous, engines cold, pilots not quite awake despite the coffee, everyone moving a little slower in the dark. The plane director took his position near the catapult, his paddles now painted half orange and half white, white gloves on his hands showing stark against the dark deck. The new hold position signal felt awkward, unnatural, crossing the paddles overhead when muscle memory screamed to hold them level, but he forced himself to commit, to make the motion large and deliberate. The Hellcat rolled forward, its engine a controlled roar, and the pilot's head turned toward the plane director, watching for instructions. Cross paddles overhead, hold position. The pilot held. Point forward with both paddles, proceed to catapult. The pilot advanced. Circular motion, then spread arms wide, wings spread for launch. The deck crew confirmed the wings locked. Forward thrust motion, both arms together, throttle up. The engine note changed, climbing to a shriek. Salute, hand off to catapult officer. The Hellcat shot down the deck and into the dark sky, climbing away over black water. 1 down. 23 to go in this launch cycle. By the time the sun rose fully, turning the ocean from black to blue, the deck was a controlled storm of activity. Aircraft cycled through launch positions, recovered birds were struck below on elevators, ordnance crews armed fighters and dive bombers, fuel crews topped off tanks, and through it all the plane directors moved, their new signals cutting through the chaos. There were a few close calls, moments of hesitation when a pilot or deck crewman expected the old signal and got the new one instead, but the confusion was brief and no metal touched metal that shouldn't have. The air boss watched from above, timing each aircraft movement, noting every hesitation, every successful handoff. When the last aircraft of the morning launch was airborne, he descended to the flight deck and found the young plane director helping secure a tow bar. "Report to my office after the recovery," was all he said, and then he was gone, leaving the plane director to wonder if he'd just saved his career or destroyed it. The recovery that afternoon was textbook, 24 aircraft back aboard in 37 minutes with 0 incidents. The evening briefing in the ready room included a rare compliment from the air boss to the deck crew, mentioning improved communication efficiency without explaining the cause. Later, in his office, he told the plane director that they would continue the new system for a full week, track the results rigorously, and then make a decision. "If this works the way you think it will," the air boss said, "we'll write it up for the task force. If it doesn't, at least we tried something." The week that followed was intense. Every launch, every recovery, every movement on deck was scrutinized. The other carriers in the task force began to notice that one ship seemed to be having fewer foul deck calls, fewer yellow shirt-initiated wave-offs, fewer moments when the deck had to be cleared for a potential disaster that ultimately didn't happen. Incident reports from that week told the story in numbers. 3 minor events in 7 days compared to the previous average of 11 in 14 days. The improvement was undeniable. What the numbers couldn't capture was the shift in confidence among the deck crew. When you knew your signals would be understood clearly, when you trusted that the pilot saw exactly what you meant and the deck crew responded without hesitation, the whole operation moved differently. Smoother. Faster, paradoxically, because there were fewer checks and double checks, fewer moments of uncertainty that forced everyone to pause and verify. The deck crew started to feel it, that sense of a machine working right instead of almost working right, and morale improved in ways that couldn't be measured but were obvious to anyone who paid attention. The turning point came 6 days into the test, during a combat launch when Japanese aircraft were reported inbound and every second mattered. The deck was chaos in the best possible way, organized chaos where 30 aircraft needed to be armed, fueled, and launched in under 20 minutes. A Hellcat was rolling toward the catapult when its port main gear started to shimmy, A potentially catastrophic mechanical failure that could collapse the gear and block the catapult for critical minutes. The plane director saw it, crossed his paddles overhead in the new hold signal, and the pilot stopped instantly, no hesitation, no second-guessing what the signal meant. The blue shirts moved in, chocked the wheels, and the damaged aircraft was towed clear in 45 seconds. A replacement Hellcat was positioned and launched without breaking the rhythm of operations. It was a small moment in a long war, but it mattered. The Air Boss wrote his report that night, documenting the test results, the methodology, the measurable improvement in safety and efficiency. He recommended adoption of the new signals across the task force, noting that while the changes were significant, they addressed a documented safety issue and the learning curve for experienced deck crew was less than 48 hours. The report went up the chain of command, through the task force commander, to Pacific Fleet headquarters, where someone decided it was worth trying on a larger scale. Within 6 weeks, 4 other Essex-class carriers had implemented the modified signals with similar results. Within 3 months, it was standard across the fast carrier task forces operating in the Pacific. The reduction in deck incidents, measured across multiple ships and thousands of operations, averaged 72% compared to the previous 6-month baseline. 72% fewer times a propeller chewed into a wing. 72% fewer times a fouled deck stopped launching fighters when Japanese planes were minutes away. 72% fewer chances for a spark to meet fuel vapor and turn a flight deck into hell. The plane director who started it all never got a medal, never got promoted ahead of his peers, never had his name in any after-action report. That wasn't how these things worked in the Navy, where ideas were supposed to come from officers and improvements were institutional rather than individual. But the men who worked the flight deck with him knew. The pilots who landed safely because a signal was unmistakable in bad weather knew. The families who got their sons and husbands back because a deck accident didn't happen, they never knew, but it mattered anyway. By the time the war ended, the modified hand signals had become so standard that most people forgot they hadn't always been that way. New deck crew learned them in training and assumed they'd been developed by some committee of experts at a safe desk somewhere, refined through careful study and official channels. The reality was messier and more human. One young man who paid attention, who couldn't stop noticing a problem, who had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way. Years later, after the carriers were decommissioned or sold for scrap, after the men who'd served on them scattered back to civilian life, occasionally 2 veterans would meet and talk about their war. Sometimes the conversation would turn to the flight deck, to the controlled chaos of launches and recoveries, to the signals that kept metal and men from colliding. And sometimes one of them would mention that the signals had changed partway through the war, gotten clearer somehow, and wonder aloud who'd made that call. The answer, if they ever learned it, was usually disappointing in its ordinariness. Just a kid from Ohio who noticed something and spoke up. But ordinary is where most of history happens. Ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, making small improvements that save lives, that reduce suffering, that move the needle just enough to matter. The plane director's innovation didn't win the war, didn't sink a battleship or shoot down an ace, didn't even earn him a single line in the official histories. What it did was make a dangerous job fractionally less dangerous, and when you multiply that fraction across thousands of launches, tens of thousands of individual signals, hundreds of thousands of moments when clarity mattered and confusion could kill, the impact becomes anything but small. The mathematics of saved lives are always speculative, built on counterfactuals and might-have-beens, but conservative estimates suggest that the new signals prevented somewhere between 15 and 30 serious deck accidents across the Pacific Fleet before war's end. Each of those accidents not only threatened the immediate crew and aircraft but could disable a carrier's air operations for hours or days, affecting combat missions, support operations, the entire calculus of naval warfare. How many pilots completed their missions because their carrier's deck was operational? How many ground troops received air support because a strike package launched on time? The causality chains extend outward, becoming too diffuse to track but no less real for their complexity. This is the nature of systemic improvements in complex operations. They create ripples that touch everything, often invisibly. A clearer signal means a faster deck cycle, means more aircraft available, means better combat. Air patrol means fewer successful enemy attacks, means more ships and sailors survive, means more invasions succeed, means the war ends sooner, perhaps by hours, perhaps by days, perhaps by some quantum that can never be precisely known but must be acknowledged as real. The young plane director understood none of this in abstract terms. He just saw a problem and fixed it. That's enough. That's everything. The broader lesson, if there is one, transcends naval aviation and World War II. In any complex system where human beings must coordinate under stress, with incomplete information, in dangerous conditions, the clarity of communication is not merely helpful but essential. Ambiguity kills. Confusion disables. Small improvements in signal design, in protocol, in the basic vocabulary of cooperation, these things matter at scale in ways that are easy to dismiss and catastrophic to ignore. The plane director's insight was not profound in a philosophical sense. It was practical, grounded, the kind of wisdom that comes from close observation and genuine care for the people around you. There's a tendency to Leoneize the big innovations, the dramatic breakthroughs, the genius inventor working alone to create something revolutionary. Those stories are true and valuable, but they're incomplete. For every radar system or code-breaking machine that changed the war, there were 1,000 smaller improvements that collectively mattered just as much: better rations, clearer orders, more efficient logistics, safer procedures. Most of these improvements came from ordinary people doing ordinary jobs who happened to notice that something wasn't working right and had the courage to suggest a fix. The courage part is not trivial. Organizations, especially military organizations during wartime, resist change by default and for good reason. Standardization saves lives by ensuring everyone operates from the same playbook. But standardization can also calcify bad practices, preserving what doesn't work simply because it's familiar. Breaking through that inertia requires not just a good idea but the willingness to risk looking foolish, to challenge authority, to persist when the initial response is dismissive or hostile. The plane director had to go over his chief's head, had to present his case to an officer who could have ended his career with a word, had to stake his reputation on the belief that he'd seen something others had missed. He got lucky in one crucial respect. His air boss was the kind of leader who listened. Not all of them were. For every good idea that got implemented, dozens were ignored or suppressed, lost because the timing was wrong or the messenger lacked credibility or the listener lacked imagination. The counterfactual history of World War II, the story of all the improvements that didn't happen, would be sobering to contemplate. How many men died because someone noticed a problem but couldn't convince anyone to care? How many inefficiencies persisted because institutional inertia was stronger than individual insight? We can't know, but the numbers are certainly not zero. What we can know, what the historical record does preserve, are the moments when the system worked as it should, when good ideas found receptive ears and practical improvements were implemented quickly enough to matter. The modified hand signals were one such moment, and there were others. Changes to damage control procedures, improvements in pilot training, modifications to aircraft design based on combat experience, thousands of small iterations that made the machine of war fractionally more effective and fractionally less lethal to the men operating it. Cumulatively, these improvements shortened the war and saved lives, though the exact accounting will always remain beyond calculation. The plane director left the Navy in late 1945, returning to Ohio and a life that had nothing to do with carrier aviation. He worked in his father's machine shop, raised a family, lived quietly for 5 decades before dying of heart failure in 1996. His obituary made no mention of the hand signals or the 72% reduction in deck accidents. Why would it? To him it had been just another day at work, a problem that needed solving, nothing heroic or particularly noteworthy. He'd done his job and moved on, as millions of veterans did, carrying their war experiences privately, rarely speaking of them, uncomfortable with anything that sounded like self-promotion or glory-seeking. But the signals remained, evolving slightly over the years as naval aviation itself evolved, jet aircraft replacing propeller-driven planes, angled decks replacing straight decks, eventually nuclear carriers replacing the oil-fired ships of World War II. The basic principle, though, the fundamental insight that visual communication must be unambiguous and distinct, that carried forward. Modern flight deck crews still use hand signals, and while the specific gestures have changed with technology and procedure, the underlying philosophy owes something to a young man who stood on a steel deck in 1944 and decided that good enough wasn't good enough when lives were at stake. This is how progress actually works, not in great leaps but in small steps, not through individual genius but through collective refinement, not by rejecting tradition but by improving it incrementally. The plane director didn't invent hand signals. Humans have been using gesture to communicate since before language existed. What he did was observe the existing system closely enough to see its flaws, creative enough to imagine improvements, and courageous enough to propose them in an environment where proposing anything could be career-ending. That combination, observation plus imagination plus courage, is rarer than it should be and more valuable than we typically acknowledge. If there's a takeaway for anyone reading this, it's that your position in the hierarchy doesn't determine the value of your insights. The plane director was nobody, a junior enlisted man whose opinions should have carried no weight against institutional practice and the accumulated wisdom of decades. But he was right, and he persisted, and eventually the system bent to accommodate his correctness. Not because he was special but because what he'd noticed was real and his proposed solution was practical. Authority deserves respect but not blind deference. Sometimes the newest person in the room sees things the veterans have learned to overlook. The other takeaway is about scale and impact. Saving 72% of deck accidents sounds impressive until you remember that the remaining 28% still happened, still caused injuries, still damaged aircraft, still created problems. No system is perfect, no solution eliminates all risk, and the pursuit of perfection can become the enemy of improvement. The plane director's new signals were better than what came before, significantly better, but not perfect. That was enough. Progress doesn't require perfection, it requires movement in the right direction and willingness to accept incremental gains as worthwhile. The Pacific War had countless stories like this one, small improvements that collectively made a difference. Better fire suppression systems on ships. More efficient supply chains. Clearer radio protocols. Improved first aid techniques. Each one was somebody's idea, somebody's observation translated into action, somebody's willingness to challenge how things had always been done. Most of these people remain anonymous, their contributions buried in technical manuals and after-action reports, unremembered except by the few who were there and saw the difference firsthand. They deserve better than anonymity, but they'd probably be uncomfortable with recognition. They did what needed doing and moved on. The night before the plane director left the carrier for the last time, his division held an informal gathering in the berthing compartment, the kind of low-key send-off that happened constantly as the war wound down and men rotated home. Someone had scrounged coffee and donuts from the galley, a minor miracle given the persistent shortages even in victory. The chief who'd initially dismissed his ideas about the signals was there, gruff as always but making a point to shake his hand and mutter something about how sometimes the kids got it right. The air boss sent down a bottle of scotch with a note saying simply, "Clear skies," which was as close to sentiment as you'd get from a man like that. They didn't talk much about the signals. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said or didn't need saying at all. They talked about where they were headed after discharge, whether any of them would stay in touch, most wouldn't, what they'd miss least about carrier life, everything, and what they'd miss most, surprisingly, also everything. The plane director was asked if he'd stay in aviation somehow, civilian work perhaps, but he shook his head. He'd had enough of the sea and wanted nothing more than to never smell F-gas again as long as he lived. Just going home to work with his hands on machines that stayed on the ground. That sounded like paradise. What he didn't say, because he was young and inarticulate about such things, was that he'd carry the flight deck with him always, the skills and the trauma and the strange pride of having done something difficult alongside people who understood what it cost. Years later he'd wake from dreams of the deck, the sound of the catapult like thunder, the smell of hot metal and fuel, the sight of aircraft hanging in the moment between flight and falling. He'd wake and remember that he was safe in Ohio, that the war was over, that the young men he'd worked beside were scattered or dead, and he'd lie there in the dark wondering if he'd done enough, saved enough, mattered enough. The answer, which he never quite believed but which was nonetheless true, was yes. If you're still with me and you want to hear more stories like this one, about the people behind the war who never made the headlines but changed outcomes in ways both small and profound, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. History is built by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, or sometimes just ordinary things done with enough care and attention to make a difference. Either way, their stories deserve telling. Thanks for listening to this one.